The dust tasted of endings. Elara felt it coat her tongue, a gritty film of despair that was as real as the hunger clawing at the pit of her belly. Her youngest, little Sarah, coughed a dry, rattling sound, her small body limp against Elara's hip. The other four were scattered around her like fallen leaves, their faces smudged with dirt and tears, their eyes wide with a fear that mirrored her own. They were a tiny, wretched island of humanity in the vast indifferent expanse of the prairie. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky, beating down on them, bleaching the color from the landscape and from their hopes. Her husband's brother, a man with a heart as barren as the land he'd just cast them onto, had stood on the porch of their home, her home, and watched them go, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. Vagrants, he had spat, the word, landing like a stone. Take your brats and be gone. This is my land now. Her milk had dried up 3 days ago. Sarah's cries had weakened from a piercing wail to a piteous, kitten-like mewling that tore at the raw edges of Elara's soul. She had begged in the last town, a dusty collection of suspicious eyes and slammed doors. They saw only a woman with too many children and no husband, a burden, a blight. They had given her nothing but scorn. Now there was nothing left. No food, no water, no hope. She sank to her knees, the rough earth scraping her skin, and pulled her children into a tight, desperate circle. She could feel the faint, frantic bird beats of their hearts against her own. She had failed them. The thought was a shard of ice in her chest. She closed her eyes, the tears finally coming, hot and useless, carving clean tracks through the grime. On her cheeks. Please, she whispered to a God she was no longer sure was listening. Please, not my babies. Take me, but not them. A sound cut through the haze of her grief, the slow, steady thud of a horse's hooves. Elara's head snapped up. A rider was approaching, a lone figure silhouetted against the blinding glare of the sun. He was a shadow in the dust, moving with a grim, unhurried purpose. Fear, sharp and primal, lanced through her. A man alone out here was a danger, another predator in a world that had already taken everything from her. She clutched Sarah tighter, her body tensing, ready to fight, to claw, to die for the small lives huddled behind her. The horse stopped a few yards away. The man swung down, his movements economical and weary. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered into a map of hard lines and quiet sorrows. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, took in the scene without pity, without judgment, just a deep, still watchfulness. He saw her ragged dress, the skeletal thinness of her children, the raw desperation in her gaze. He saw it all. He didn't speak. He unstrapped a small, dusty satchel from his saddle, his movements deliberate. From it, he pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle. He unwrapped it to reveal a single dense loaf of dark bread. His last one. Elara's eyes fixed on it, her stomach twisting into a painful knot. Her oldest boy, Samuel, let out a small, involuntary whimper. The man's gaze flickered to the boy, a barely perceptible softening in the hard set of his jaw. He broke the loaf in half, then broke one of the halves into 5 smaller pieces. He walked forward slowly, his boots crunching on the dry ground, and knelt before them. He held out the pieces of bread. The children stared, unmoving, too afraid to reach. Elara looked from the bread to the man's face. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep, abiding loneliness that seemed to cling to him like the dust on his coat. He was not a savior. He was just another broken soul in this godforsaken land. But he was offering them his last meal. Take it, he said, his voice a low rumble, rough like gravel. It was not a command, not a plea. It was a simple statement of fact. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was calloused and warm. She took the bread and gave a piece to each child, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage it. They ate with a ravenous silence. intensity that was heartbreaking to watch. The man watched them, his face unreadable. He then held out the remaining half of the loaf to her. She shook her head. "You," she rasped, her voice cracking. He pushed it into her hand. "I'm closer to home than you are," he said, a statement that held a universe of meaning. He stood, turned without another word, and swung back onto his horse. He didn't look back. He just rode away, disappearing back into the shimmering heat from which he had come, a fleeting shadow who had answered a prayer she hadn't even known how to finish. His name was Silas. His ranch was a lonely stretch of land carved out of the unforgiving wilderness, a place of profound silence broken only by the wind and the lowing of his cattle. The silence was his penance, his sanctuary, his prison. His cabin was neat, clean, and empty. It smelled of dust and wood smoke and the ghost of a life that had been extinguished 5 years prior. The fever had taken his wife Mary and their infant son in the space of a week, leaving a hole in his world so vast and absolute that he had simply sealed it off, building a wall of solitude around his heart. He worked from sunup to sundown, the physical exhaustion a welcome anesthetic for the ache that never truly left him. He was a man of routine, of fences to be mended and cattle to be driven, each task a small prayer against the encroaching memories. The townsfolk respected him for his grit, but kept their distance. They saw the hardness in his eyes and mistook it for cruelty, not knowing it was the scar tissue over a wound that would not heal. When he saw the woman and her children again, they were a heap of rags and limbs just inside his property line, collapsed in the meager shade of a lone, twisted juniper. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. He had expected them to move on, to become someone else's problem. But they hadn't. They had simply run out of life. He dismounted, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The woman, Alara, was barely conscious, her face pale and drawn. The children were asleep so deep it looked terrifyingly close to death. He stood over them for a long moment, the silence of his life roaring in his ears. He could ride on. He could leave them to the coyotes and the cold night. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. But he saw the faint rise and fall of the smallest child's chest, and he saw the ghost of his own son, and something in him, a thing he thought long dead, broke open. With a curse that was half prayer, he began the arduous task of lifting them, one by one, and carrying them home. The cabin, his silent fortress, was instantly invaded. The air, once still and sterile, was now thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, fear, and the faint, sweet smell of sleeping children. He laid them on blankets on the floor, their small, exhausted faces looking impossibly fragile in the flickering lamplight. He moved with a grim efficiency, fetching water, stoking the fire. Ilara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Panic flared in them as she took in the strange surroundings. "Where?" She started, trying to sit up. "You're at my ranch," Silas said, his voice flat. "You collapsed." She scrambled to her children, her hands flying over them, checking for breath, for life. Reassured, she turned back to him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp with a mother's defensiveness. It was the question he had been asking himself. "Nothin'," he grunted, turning away to stir a pot of thin stew on the hearth. "Just for you to not die on my land." The days that followed were a tense, unspoken negotiation. There was no easy comfort, no gentle welcome. There was only the brutal reality of survival. The cabin was too small, the silence shattered by the chaotic energy of 5 children. Ilara, fueled by a fierce, prideful shame, worked relentlessly. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, washed their tattered clothes in the creek until her knuckles were raw, and cooked what little food Silas provided with a desperate ingenuity, stretching every scrap to feed the hungry mouths. She was trying to pay a debt she felt she owed, to prove she was not a burden. Silas watched her, his face a stony mask, his silence a wall between them. He was a man accustomed to solitude, and the constant presence of this family was a grating. Irritant, the children's laughter felt like a sacrilege in the house where his own child's cries had faded into nothing. He retreated further into himself, his words clipped, his interactions minimal. He would leave food on the table and disappear for the day, mending fences on the farthest edge of his property, seeking the familiar comfort of his loneliness. One afternoon, he returned to find Ilara in the neglected garden patch behind the cabin, her hands deep in the dry, cracked earth, pulling weeds with a furious energy. Her face was smudged with dirt, her brow furrowed in concentration. He stood for a moment, watching the determined set of her shoulders. She was trying to bring life back to a place he had let die. He walked over, his shadow falling across her. She looked up, startled. "The soil's no good," he said, his voice rough. "Too dry." She didn't flinch. "It's better than nothing," she retorted, her chin jutting out. "It needs a well. And water." He saw the challenge in her eyes, the refusal to surrender. He grunted, turned, and came back with a shovel and 2 buckets. He didn't offer help. He just started digging a new irrigation trench from the creek, his movements powerful and efficient. She watched him for a moment, then went back to her work, the two of them toiling in a shared stubborn silence under the hot sun. It was not a partnership. It was 2 solitudes working side by side. The nights were the hardest. The cabin would fall quiet, the children asleep in a pile of blankets, and the ghosts would return. Silas would sit by the dying fire, the empty rocking chair in the corner a stark reminder of Mary. He could almost hear her humming, feel the warmth of her presence. And now, in her place, was this strange woman, this Ilara, her breathing soft. And even from the other side of the room, he felt a confusing mix of resentment and a strange, unwelcome flicker of something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He saw the way she looked at her children, a fierce, all-consuming love that was both beautiful and painful to witness. It was a love he had once known. He would close his eyes, his hands clenching into fists, and fight the memories down. The first crack in his wall came during a storm. A sudden violent squall swept across the prairie, the rain coming down in blinding sheets, the wind howling like a banshee. Little Sarah, weakened from her earlier starvation, developed a fever. Her skin was burning, her breathing shallow and ragged. Ilara was frantic, her composure finally shattering. She bathed the child's forehead with cool water, her hands trembling, her whispered pleas lost in the roar of the wind. Silas watched from the doorway, a cold dread gripping him. He had stood by helplessly once before as a fever stole a life he cherished. The memory was a physical blow. He saw the terror in Ilara's eyes, the same terror that had haunted his own nightmares for 5 years. He turned, grabbed his coat and hat, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Ilara cried, her voice laced with panic. "The medicine woman," he said over the shriek of the wind. "In the hills, she has herbs for fever. You can't. The creek will be flooded. It's too dangerous." He didn't answer. He just stepped out into the raging storm, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving Ilara alone with her fear and the flickering lamplight. He rode through the night, a man possessed, fighting the rising water and the ghosts of his past, driven by a grim determination not to let history repeat itself in his house. Word of the widow and her 5 children living at the Silas Ranch spread through the nearby town of Redemption like a prairie fire. It was carried on the whispers of the women at the general store, debated by the men at the saloon. Redemption was a town built on a fragile foundation of propriety and harsh judgment, and Silas's act of charity was seen not as kindness, but as folly, as scandal. The land baron, Augustus Thorne, a man whose piety was as false as the gold, watch chain stretched across his ample belly, saw it as an opportunity. Thorn had been trying to get his hands on Silas's land for years. Its access to the river was crucial to his own expansion plans. He began to sow the seeds of poison. A man of his age, taking in a strange woman, he'd say, his voice oozing sanctimonious concern, and all those mouths to feed. It's not decent. It will bring ruin upon him, and a blight upon this community. The whispers grew into open scorn. When Silas rode into town for supplies, he was met with cold shoulders and hostile stares. Men who had once nodded to him in respect now turned away. Women gathered their children closer as he passed, as if he were a contagion. "Heard you're running an orphanage now, Silas," one man sneered from the saloon steps. "Or is it a whorehouse?" Silas's hand tightened on the reins of his horse, his face hardening into granite, but he said nothing. He loaded his wagon in a stony silence. That dared anyone to approach him further. The town's judgment was a heavy, suffocating blanket. They called Ilara his bought woman, a vagrant who had trapped a lonely fool. They called her children bastards and leeches. The cruelty was a constant, low-grade fever, infecting every interaction. Ilara felt it most keenly. She had stayed hidden at the ranch, but the scorn reached her nonetheless, carried on the wind, reflected in the grim set of Silas's jaw when he returned from town. The shame she had felt on the prairie returned, a bitter taste in her mouth. She was a stain on this man's life, a source of his humiliation. One evening, as Silas was unhitching the wagon, she found the courage to speak. "You should send us away," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're right. We are a blight on you." Silas stopped what he was doing, his back still to her. He stood there for a long moment, the only sound the creak of the leather harness in his hands. Then he turned, his eyes finding hers in the twilight. "I don't give a damn what they say," he said, his voice low and fierce. "This is my land. I decide who stays." It wasn't a declaration of affection. It was a statement of defiance, a stubborn man's refusal to be bowed. But for Ilara, it was a shield. It was the first time anyone had stood for her since her husband died, but not all hearts in redemption were hard. One afternoon, as Silas was loading flour onto his wagon, a woman approached him. It was Greta Schmidt, the blacksmith's wife. A quiet, stoic German woman who had lost 2 of her own children to the winter cough. She didn't say a word. She simply placed a large, neatly folded bundle on top of the flour sacks. It was a collection of outgrown children's clothes, patched and clean, and a small jar of her own preserved peaches. She met Silas's questioning gaze with a look of profound, shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of a grief that needed no words. She nodded once, a gesture of solidarity that was more powerful than any sermon, and walked away. Silas stared at the bundle, a strange tightness in his throat. It was a small act, a tiny crack in the wall of the town's hostility. But it was enough. It was a reminder that even in the harshest of lands, decency could still find a way to take root. The first snow came early, a fine white powder that dusted the prairie and sharpened the bite of the wind. The garden was harvested, its meager offerings stored away. The cabin was fortified against the coming cold, the cracks chinked with mud and grass. An uneasy rhythm had settled over them. It was not the rhythm of a family, but of a small, besieged garrison. The children, resilient as weeds, had begun to thaw. They followed Silas around the ranch like a flock of small, curious birds, their initial fear replaced by a cautious awe. He never played with them, never offered a gentle word, but he began to teach them. He showed Samuel how to whittle a piece of wood into a crude bird, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. He taught the twin girls how to identify animal tracks in the snow. He let little Sarah, now healthy and bright-eyed, touch the velvet nose of his steady old horse. He did it all with a gruff reluctance, as if annoyed at himself for the small acts of tenderness, but he did them nonetheless. Augustus Thorne watched the changing season with a cold, calculating patience. He saw the smoke rising from Silas's chimney, saw the small figures of the children playing in the snow, and his greed curdled into a venomous resolve. Silas was not collapsing under the weight of his new responsibilities. He was hardening, becoming more entrenched. Thorne knew he had to strike, to sever the root of this burgeoning family before it could truly grow. He spent weeks with the towns. Lawyer, a man as pliable as warm wax, poring over old land deeds and water charters. And then he found it, a loophole, a dusty clause in the original town charter that gave the council authority over water allocation from the Redemption River. In times of community hardship. It was flimsy, a legal fiction, but in the town he controlled, it would be enough. He would declare Silas's new family a hardship, a drain on resources, and he would legally divert the flow of the river away from Silas's land, choking the ranch to death. He called a public town meeting. The notice was posted on the church door and in the general store. It was a summons, a public trial masquerading as civic duty. When Silas read it, his face became a mask of cold fury. This was not about water, it was about extermination. "He means to break us," Ilara said, her voice tight with fear as she read the notice over his shoulder. "He means to break you," Silas corrected, his voice grim. "You and the children are just his excuse." That night, the cabin was suffocatingly silent. The children were asleep. Ilara and Silas sat at the small wooden table, the flickering lamplight casting long dancing shadows on the walls. The end felt near, inevitable. "We could leave," Ilara whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Tonight. Slip away before the meeting." Silas stared into the flame of the lamp, his jaw tight. He could run. He could take this woman and her children and disappear into the vastness of the territory. Start over where no one knew his name, his history, his grief. It was the sensible path. But then his eyes fell on the small, crudely carved bird Samuel had left on the mantelpiece. He looked at the neatly patched clothes Greta Schmidt had given them. He thought of the feel of Sarah's small hand in his. Running felt like a betrayal. Not just of Ilara, but of the man he was slowly, painfully becoming. "No," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I've been running for 5 years. I'm done running. This is my home." He looked at her, his stormy eyes holding hers. "This is our home. We fight." The meeting hall was packed. It felt less like a town council and more like a coliseum, the air thick with anticipation and malice. Thorne sat at the head table, flanked by his cronies on the council, his face flushed with power. The townsfolk filled the benches, their faces a mixture of curiosity, righteousness, and a grim, mob-like hunger. When Silas and Ilara entered, a hush fell over the room. They walked down the central aisle, a solitary island in a sea of hostility. Ilara walked with her head held high, her hand resting on Silas's arm, a silent public declaration of their unity. The 5 children were with them, clean and solemn, clinging to Ilara's skirt. They sat in the front row, alone. Thorne began, his voice dripping with false piety. He spoke of community, of shared values, of the burden of the unfortunate. He painted Ilara as a temptress and her children as parasites. He painted Silas as a fool, a man whose misplaced charity threatened the prosperity of the entire town. "The law is clear," he concluded, his voice booming in the silent hall. "In times of hardship, the council has the right to protect the resources of this community, and this situation is a hardship. Therefore, we will vote to divert the water from the Silas Ranch to more productive enterprises." He smiled, a predator's thin, cruel smile. He had them. There was no one to speak for the outcast rancher and the vagrant woman. He called for the vote. Hands began to go up. And then, a voice, clear and steady, cut through the silence. "You speak of hardship." It was Ilara. She stood up. Her heart pounding but her voice unwavering. She was not the starving, desperate creature from the prairie. She was transformed, her dignity a shield and a sword. Let me tell you of hardship. Hardship is watching your children starve while men of God slam their doors in your face. Hardship is being cast out of your own home with nothing but the clothes on your back. She looked around the room, her eyes meeting the gazes of the women, the mothers. And let me tell you of decency. Decency is a man who gives his last piece of bread to a stranger. It is a man who opens his home to the homeless, who protects the weak, who asks for nothing in return. Her voice grew stronger, ringing with a power that came from the very core of her being. You talk of water rights and law, but you know nothing of honor. This man, she said, turning to place a hand on Silas's shoulder, has more honor in his silence than you have in all your hollow prayers, Augustus Thorne. This is not a hardship, this is a family, and we will not be broken by you. A stunned silence followed her words. Thorne's face was purple with rage. He was about to slam his gavel down when the doors at the back of the hall creaked open. A man entered, his face weathered, his hands stained with the rich, dark earth of his farm. It was Mr. Schmidt, the blacksmith, Greta's husband. He walked slowly down the aisle and stood behind Silas. Then the doors opened again. An old, wizened woman, the medicine woman from the hills whom Silas had ridden through a storm to find, entered. She stood beside the blacksmith. Then came another family. The O'Malley's Irish sheep herders from the high country. Silas had once spent 3 days helping them find their flock after a blizzard, refusing any payment. They stood with the others. Then came the Jacksons, a family of freed slaves who had a small homestead downriver. Silas had shared his seed, corn with them during the drought 2 years back. They joined the silent, growing line. Finally, a tall, quiet man of the Lakota Nation, a tracker named Two Owls, entered with his son. Silas had once tracked a mountain lion that had been preying on their horses and had treated them with a respect they found nowhere else. He and his son took their place. They were the 5 tribes of the wilderness, the scattered, solitary families of the frontier. They were the German, the healer, the Irish, the freedman, the native. They were the people the town of Redemption had ignored, dismissed, or feared. And they had all been touched by Silas's quiet, unheralded decency. They said nothing. They did not need to. They simply stood there, a silent, unbreachable wall of loyalty behind the man who had earned it. They were the community that mattered. Thorne stared at them, his mouth agape. His power, built on fear and division, crumbled against this silent, solid testament to character. The hands that had been raised to vote against Silas slowly, one by one, went down. The town watched, shamed and awed. The battle was over. The snows melted, and the river, full and life-giving, continued to flow to the Silas ranch. The land drank deeply, and in the spring, the garden Ilara had so stubbornly tilled exploded with life. The cabin was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of laughter, of Samuel learning to read, of the girls singing off-key, of Sarah taking her first wobbly steps. The scars were still there, in the quiet moments when Silas would stare into the fire, or when a shadow of the past would cross Ilara's face. But they were no longer gaping wounds. They were part of the tapestry of their lives, threads of sorrow, woven together with threads of hope. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the ranch, they stood on the porch, watching the children play. The community that had once shunned them now offered quiet nods of respect. Greta Schmidt was a frequent visitor, bringing pies and sharing sewing patterns with Ilara. Mr. O'Malley had gifted them a lamb. The tribes of the wilderness had bound them all together. Silas reached out and took Ilara's hand. His touch was no longer clumsy or reluctant. It was sure, steady, and warm. He looked from the children, their small silhouettes dark against the vibrant sky to her face, her beautiful strong face. "The well was never dry," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer fought to hide. The house was just empty. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. It was not a grand declaration, but it was everything. It was a promise. It was a home. They were not two broken souls anymore. They were two halves of a whole, forged in the crucible of hardship and loss, made complete by the family they had chosen. They were broken, and now they were whole. The community had stood witness. The land had stood witness. He had given her his last piece of bread, and she, in turn, had given him back the world.